There's this uncomfortable truth about global power that most people never say out loud. Great nations almost never collapse because a stronger rival defeats them. They collapse because they sabotage themselves from the inside, convinced that their old assumptions still make sense while the ground beneath them quietly shifts. And if you look at the world today, Russia grinding its economy and military into dust for a few shattered provinces, China tightening its political system as it faces the biggest demographic decline in its history, and the United States wrestling with its own internal contradictions, you start to see a pattern repeating itself. It's not about who has more missiles or more soldiers. It's about who understands the long game and who is blindly walking into the same traps that have swallowed empires throughout history. Professor Sarah Payne spells this out with a kind of clarity. Putin wanted territory. But whatever he gets, and it may be zero, will be a glowing wreck because he's bombed it flat. That line lands because it reveals the contradiction at the heart of Russia's war. The thing Moscow claims to be fighting for is the thing it is actively destroying. This isn't a strategy. This is self-destruction disguised as strength, and once you recognize it, you start to question how many other strong nations are marching down the same road. Grand strategy is the integration of all instruments of national power to achieve national goals, she says, and it's one of those phrases that seems simple until you unpack it. It's not just military planning. It's everything: the economy, diplomacy, alliances, industry, political institutions, and even national identity. It's the whole toolkit, and it works across multiple layers: the tactical level, where individual units fight; the operational level, where battles connect into campaigns; the strategic level, where leaders define the political purpose of a war; and above all of it, grand strategy, shaping the environment that a nation must live in, both in peace and in conflict. This is where Payne draws one of the most important distinctions in modern geopolitics: the difference between democracies and autocracies. From the outside, democracies look messy. Leaders change. Parties fight. Policies swing back and forth. But Payne argues that this chaos is actually a feature, not a flaw. People assume democracies can't have a strategy because everything looks disorganized, she says. But that chaos is how the sausage gets made. It's how bad decisions get corrected. Debate forces adaptation. Elections force accountability. The friction is ugly, but it stops mistakes from becoming permanent. Autocracies, in contrast, project an illusion of stability and clarity: one leader, one vision, no dissent. But that's exactly what makes them brittle. Payne doesn't sugarcoat it. Dictators don't like hearing the counter-argument, and they double down on bad decisions. When no one can tell the leader he's wrong, the entire system becomes blind. That's how you get Russia plunging into a war that weakens its long-term position. That's how you get China drifting toward policies that strangle the very growth that made it powerful. And that's how great powers start to collapse, not through a single disaster, but through years of unchallenged errors stacking on top of each other. This is the real story behind today's geopolitical crises: a long arc of decisions, incentives, and blind spots shaping the fate of nations. Once you start seeing it, the news stops looking like chaos and starts looking like the predictable consequences of systems that can't correct themselves. And this is where our journey into grand strategy begins. Once you start thinking about self-destruction as the real engine behind the rise and fall of great powers, the last decade begins to look very different. The peaceful stretch after the Cold War, the part we all assumed would last forever, now feels more like an intermission, a brief pause before the old patterns re-emerged. Professor Payne argues that this shift isn't hypothetical or slowly approaching. We're in Cold War number 2, she says, and she's not being dramatic. She's describing a set of decisions that Russia and China made long before tanks rolled across the Ukrainian border. For her, the turning point sits somewhere between 2012 and 2014. In Russia, Putin returned to the presidency, crushed protests, and signaled that political openness would no longer be tolerated. In China, Xi Jinping consolidated power and began reversing decades of gradual liberalization, pulling the country back toward a rigid, centralized model designed to protect the party rather than empower society. These weren't domestic quirks. They were strategic pivots, shifts from economic openness toward political control. And once both countries began moving in that direction, confrontation with the West became almost inevitable. Then came 2014, and with it, the world's first real glimpse of what this new era would look like. Putin annexed Crimea and ignited a war in eastern Ukraine, not as a limited operation, but as a deliberate, public rejection of the European security order. The West reacted slowly, unsure whether this was an anomaly or a new doctrine. Payne says the answer became unavoidable years later. The 2022 invasion wasn't a surprise to anyone who understood the pattern. It was simply the next logical step in a strategy built on territorial nostalgia rather than modern power. And as she explains, this is where wars reshape nations in ways that outlast the front lines. Payne points to American history, identity forged in the Revolutionary War, then solidified in the Civil War, as millions of people were forced into shared purpose. War can destroy, but it can also define. That's why she believes Ukraine is transforming deeper than most outsiders realize. Ukraine will come out of this with a very powerful national identity, she says, because crisis pushes nations to discover what they actually are. Cooperation, innovation, improvisation, all of it is happening under pressure, and it is changing the country permanently. Meanwhile, Russia is hollowing itself out. Decades of Soviet-era military stockpiles have been fed into Ukraine and annihilated. Skilled workers have fled. Investment has evaporated. The economy shrinks while Western economies keep growing, widening the gap year after year. Payne is blunt about the consequences. Putin has made his country so much weaker, she says, and you can hear the exhaustion in her voice, the frustration of watching a nation sabotage itself for goals it can't actually achieve. But the most dangerous consequence might not even be in Ukraine. It might be sitting quietly along Russia's eastern border. Putin has been insisting that historical claims justify revising borders, but Payne reminds us how absurdly risky that argument is. That logic absolutely applies to Siberia, she says, because Russia seized an enormous amount of territory from China, more land, she notes, than all US territory east of the Mississippi River. And China has never forgotten. If Putin is rewriting the rules of territorial legitimacy, he's opening a door Beijing could someday walk through. What Payne is really describing is not just a war or a rivalry or a geopolitical shift. She's describing a world sliding back into a competitive logic where autocrats make big, irreversible decisions behind closed doors, and the rest of the world lives with the consequences. And as she continues unraveling this picture, the deeper strategic stakes begin to reveal themselves. As dark as Russia's strategic future looks, Payne warns that the real danger isn't just what Moscow is doing now, but how the world responds to it. The United States is trying to help Ukraine win without triggering the one outcome that would redefine global security forever. You don't want to push Putin into a corner where he lobs a nuke, she says, and she means exactly what the words imply. The moment a nuclear weapon is used, even once, every norm collapses, countries panic, proliferation spreads. The world becomes a place where every government decides it needs a nuclear shield simply to survive. And in Payne's words, it will not make the world a safer place. This is why the Western strategy feels slower and more measured than people expect. It isn't about dramatic breakthroughs. It's about controlled pressure, keeping Ukraine supplied while preventing escalation into something irreversible. It's the uncomfortable part of power, knowing you have overwhelming strength, but choosing not to use it recklessly. Payne sees this not as weakness but as strategic maturity, because victory that triggers catastrophe isn't victory at all. At the same time, Russia's invasion, meant to divide the West, has done the opposite. Democracies that once hesitated to invest in defense are now rebuilding their militaries. Countries that stayed neutral for centuries, like Sweden and Finland, have joined NATO. And Payne captures the irony with a clarity that almost feels cinematic. NATO is the most efficient organization for getting 32 countries to agree. And when they agree, it's powerful. Putin expected fragmentation. What he got was unity sharpened by urgency. But unity doesn't solve Russia's internal decay. Payne lays out a bleak assessment: years of accumulated Soviet weapons shredded in Ukraine, a shrinking economy, brain drain, a near total dependence on China. These are not temporary setbacks. They are deep structural wounds that will define Russia's next decades. And the dependency on Beijing, she argues, may become the most destabilizing of all. The question isn't whether the Vlad-Xi bromance will break down, but when, she says, because China doesn't ignore historical grievances or strategic opportunities. It simply waits for the best moment. This brings Payne to a larger point about why Russia's worldview is failing. Moscow still behaves as if the world's power structure is built on land borders, territory, and physical expansion, the same logic that shaped empires before the Industrial Revolution. But that era is gone. Modern power rests on something entirely different: innovation, trade networks, industrial capacity, human capital, alliances. And Payne distills this shift with surgical clarity. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, power was indeed a function of land. But after it, compounded growth from trade, industry, and commerce became the origin of power. Russia never adapted to that transition. China did, until it began suffocating its own economic dynamism under political centralization. The United States, despite its political chaos, still benefits from a system that corrects itself before mistakes become fatal. That, Payne argues, is the quiet advantage democracies hold: not perfection, but self-correction. By the time she lays this out, a larger picture comes into focus. The defining struggle of the 21st century isn't simply Russia versus the West or China versus the United States. It's a clash between systems that can evolve and systems that lock themselves into brittle trajectories. Rivals rarely defeat the great powers that fall. They are defeated by the assumptions they refuse to abandon. When Payne finally turns to China, it doesn't feel like a new chapter. It feels like the next logical step in the same story. A rising power that once understood the mechanics of modern strength now risks everything by tightening its grip, just as the world demands more flexibility, not less. For decades, China's strategy was simple: plug into the global system the United States built, grow faster than anyone else, and let economic momentum solve everything else. But the China we see now is different. Xi Jinping has pushed the country back toward ideological control, rigid centralization, and a political environment where dissent isn't just discouraged, it's erased. And when you silence dissent, you silence the warning signs. This is where Payne draws a line that connects directly back to Russia. Autocracies don't just make mistakes. They multiply them because no one can safely point them out. Dictators double down on bad decisions, she reminds us. The same dynamic that pushed Putin into a catastrophic war and could just as easily steer China into its own strategic miscalculations, whether in the South China Sea, in its economic model, or across the Taiwan Strait. The danger isn't that China lacks ambition. It's that ambition without correction becomes delusion. Yet even with all this, Payne never frames the United States as invincible or uniquely wise. In fact, she argues the opposite. America's strength comes not from perfect leadership or flawless planning, but from a political ecosystem that forces renewal. Elections, arguments, public pressure, institutional checks, these things look messy, but they prevent the worst outcomes. The system itself is designed to survive its leaders. But surviving isn't enough. Payne's larger message is that the world is entering a period where grand strategy matters again. The comfortable assumptions of the post-Cold War era that trade would pacify rivals, that autocracies would liberalize as they grew richer, that nuclear weapons would remain unthinkable, are gone. In their place is a world where powerful nations are reverting to older instincts, competing for influence, pressuring borders, testing alliances, and reviving the logic of zero-sum geopolitics. And in this new environment, misunderstanding the true sources of power becomes fatal. That's why she hammers this point over and over. Territory is not strength. Conquest is not growth. And any nation that behaves as if the Industrial Revolution never happened is setting itself up for failure. Power today comes from compounded growth, from trade, industry, and commerce, she says. And the countries that embrace that reality will outlast those that chase fantasies of imperial geography. By the end of the conversation, you're left with a very different view of global politics. Not a soap opera of individual leaders making dramatic choices, but a slow gravitational pull driven by systems that encourage adaptation or punish rigidity. Russia is collapsing under the weight of outdated assumptions. China is approaching a crossroads where political control may undermine economic strength. The United States is noisy and divided, but capable of self-correction in ways closed systems can't match. Pain doesn't end with predictions, because predictions are the wrong tool for understanding a world shaped by human decisions. Instead, she ends with patterns, the kinds of patterns that show up again and again across history. Great powers rise not because they conquer land, but because they build systems that let people innovate, trade, argue, and reinvent themselves, and they fall when they stop doing those things. If there's one message she wants us to walk away with, it's that strategic failure isn't inevitable. It's chosen, piece by piece, every time a nation clings to old habits instead of adapting to new realities. And in a century defined by rapid change, the countries willing to challenge their own assumptions loudly, openly, and repeatedly are the ones most likely to endure.